Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Dresden, and I'm a Senior Program Associate at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you all for joining us for today's event, Missed Histories, Overlooked Stories in Russian Studies from the Overlooked. I'd like to thank the Department of World Languages and Cultures at Howard University for co-sponsoring today's event, which is presented as part of the Kennan Institute's Black History Month program. Before we begin, I encourage you to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, as well as our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File. And for those who are very interested in the current developments around Russia and Ukraine and the massive military forces at the border, there's a collection page at the Wilson Center called Hindsight Up Front Ukraine. Just put that in Google, it'll take you right to the page and you'll find the latest content and commentary on that. A final piece of housekeeping: if you'd like to pose a question throughout the program, please submit that via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions so that we can identify who's asking them. And right now, it is my pleasure to welcome the moderator for today's panel, Dr. Amaryllis Luga-de-Fabritz, Master Instructor for Russian at Howard University's Department of World Languages and Cultures. Amaryllis received her bachelor's degree in Russian language and literature with honors from Brown University, then earned a Master of Art in International Studies in Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies from the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle, and then her doctorate in Slavic languages and literatures, also at the University of Washington. Amaryllis's research includes her work in Russian and East European cinema, Russian literature of the 19th and 20th century, Spanish language, literature, and culture, Spanish cinema of the post-Franco era, and Cuban cinema, as well as gender studies. Amaryllis, the floor is yours. We look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Amaryllis Luga-de-Fabritz, and I am the Master Instructor of Russian at Howard University, the only historically Black university with a Russian program, which is our Russian language and literature minor. I am also the director of the grant-funded National Mentorship Program, the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Scholarship undergraduate REES think tank, known as Ideas for REES as for short. And we strive to help build the pipeline for future REES area specialists of diverse backgrounds by encouraging research by undergraduates. And it's due to this project that I am particularly excited to moderate this panel with three of the most talented emerging African-American talent in the field of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies. They not only represent new trends in research methodologies, they also represent the variety of backgrounds that are currently diversifying our field. And I particularly want to thank the Kennan Institute for hosting this panel as part of Black History Month. Panels such as this help address the need for increased representation and role models in our field. So let me start by introducing today's panel and our first speaker, Alexa Kurmanov. Alexa Kurmanov is a PhD student in the anthropology department at the University of California, Berkeley. Their research focuses on discourses on the category of women deployed by the state, local nationalist groups, the public and feminists, and LGBTQI organizations in post-socialist Kyrgyzstan. They are interested in the meanings of queerness, Blackness, colonialism, erasure, and the praxis of intersectionality in Central Asia. Thank you, Alexa. And before I introduce our next speaker, a reminder that if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than raising your hand. We will be monitoring the question and answers through the event, and we'll move to your questions following the presentations. We also have Louis Porter, who is an assistant professor at Texas State University, where he teaches courses on the history of Russia and Eurasia, and his research focuses on Soviet internationalism, cultural diplomacy in the 20th century. His current book project, A History of Soviet Participation in UNESCO During the Cold War, explores Soviet experiences of world governance, world citizenship, and international community. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2018. And we will also hear from Kimberly St. Julian-Varnon. She's a doctoral student at the History of University of Pennsylvania. Her work examines the intersections of Black experience in Soviet understandings of race and nationality. So we are going to start by turning the floor over to Alexa Kurmanov.
Thank you. I would like to thank Howard University and the Kennan Institute for hosting this panel today and for inviting me to participate. My presentation will be split into two parts. The first part, I will talk about my journey as a Black queer woman and mother in pursuing a PhD to give context of why I became interested in feminist movements in Central Asia and what led me to engaging in research in the region. The second part of my presentation will be geared towards the ever contentious dialogue between post-socialist studies, studies of the USSR, and post-colonial studies. A key theme you may notice throughout my presentation is the action of forgetting. I recently replaced my use of the word erasure with forgetting because I found that it is an action, or it is the action of forgetting that provokes my research, and perhaps it always has. When I received the invitation to speak on this panel, I had been reading Alexa Shotwell's book, Against Purity, Living Ethically in Compromised Times. And just a few weeks prior to that, I had just finished Saidiya Hartman's more recent book, Wayward Life's Beautiful Experiments. And so both of these works account for colonialism's intimate and complex and contradictory relationship with forgetting. And because I see Central Asia as both post-socialist and post-colonial, turning to the action of forgetting when referring to feminist and LGBTQ movements in Central Asia instead of the word erasure seems like a better way to understand the space in which Central Asia inhabits. Forgetting instead of erasure also for me holds the possibility of futurity. So also when I saw the title of this panel, I immediately singled out the keywords missed and overlooked, which made me return to a quote in Shotwell's first chapter of her book, where she talks about colonialism and memory. It's important to note that she's using Roxanne Dunbar Ort's formulation of unforgetting, which I will read just a short quote now. What is the opposite of truth? We think immediately the lie, but in Greek, the opposite of truth is forgetting. This is a very subtle thing. What is the action you take to tell the truth? It is unforgetting. That is really meaningful to me. It is not that the origin of the myth is a lie. It is the process of forgetting that is the real problem. Alliances without unforgetting and at their core aren't going anywhere in the long run. So it is a dilemma, but we have to find a way. So here for me, unforgetting is like an activity, which also implies that forgetting is one too. And I see forgetting as a tool and logic of colonialisms. So why am I talking about this? The actions of forgetting and unforgetting, as aforementioned, are a core part of my project. I turned my attention more towards Central Asia after my first trip to Russia in 2018. And the issue that caused me to shift my project from Black nationalism's connections to the Soviet Union to the relationship between Central Asia and Russia involved what I personally witnessed when I visited Moscow and St. Petersburg. In those two cities, I saw hierarchies between Africans, Central Asians, and ethnic white Russians that also existed in the US context. I noticed that these interactions between everyday people were both similar and different to my own context. Africans living in Moscow handed out flyers on the street. Central Asians were doing construction work and domestic work. And I began to see the logic of race and racisms operating on different registers. In other words, what was happening in practice in the everyday was not matching the discourse and the literature in Western academia on histories of the Soviet Union or the discourses deployed by the state. And this, for me, even extends to the everyday memory of the Soviet Union as told by locals. The conversations I would have with various people on the absence of race, both uninvited and invited, when I was in Russia in the summer of 2018, reminded me of conversations I was having 10 years earlier about conceptualizations of race in the Russian-speaking community of Brighton Beach, located in New York City. Although both conversations and the people that I was having these conversations with had changed, the logic remained the same. The idea that the Soviet Union and contemporary Russia was and is raceless, and that class or ethnicity are the only forms of marginalization. And because Imperial Russia was not implicated in the Atlantic slave trade, then somehow they're exempt from a colonial past. The constant uttering that the Soviet Union was a raceless space not only feeds into the logic that Eurasia, and if we want to be more particular, that Russia in our present time is exempt from a colonial past, and continues to be racist. But for me, it also feeds into the logic that racism and conceptualization is a conceptualization from the West, i.e. America. So this experience going to Russia combined with academic literature brought up a lot of questions for me. Mainly, why was there such a disconnect between post-colonial studies, post-socialist studies, and studies of the Soviet Union? And why was there so much anxiety about thinking alongside these two or three epistemics? And whose perspectives were missing and why? So these questions eventually came to underlie my inquiry of how to use an intersectional approach that didn't involve or that didn't privilege the economic, i.e. class, over other social formations such as ethnicity, race, gender, and sexuality in the context of Central Asia. And when I first went to Kyrgyzstan in the summer of 2019, the various parts of my questions really began to come together. And I owe most of this to local feminists and my host family. My host family was a matriarch and contradicted a lot of the constructed narratives about the condition of women in Central Asia. For instance, flattened and homogenous narratives about mobility, which are typically imposed onto predominantly Muslim countries, and construct particular figurations of both brown men and brown men and brown women. For example, women not being able to drive or allowed to drive, men being the heads of households, domestic violence towards women, and bride kidnappings. And I'm not saying this to downplay the fact that these things do happen in that space, because they do, but this is not the only space or the only place where these things happen. So being with my host family and having an exchange of dialogue with women who self-identified and women who didn't self-identify as feminists, but who in many ways practice certain forms of feminism, was helpful in thinking about how the multiple layers of women's experiences, how they navigated registers of sexism, racism, and homophobia in the everyday. So these moments, or those moments, in spending time with other marginalized groups in Kyrgyzstan allowed me to bridge connections and find similarities and differences between my subjectivity as a Black queer woman and theirs. And on my second visit later that year, I attended a biennial feminist exhibit, Feminale, which was curated by Altine Kapalova. And if you've heard me speak before, I speak a lot about this particular event. And so it was curated by Altine Kapalova and also an organization called the Bishkek Feminist Initiative. And so I arrived at the end of this exhibition, and just to give some context, just before I arrived, local nationalists and the Kyrgyz state attempted to shut down this exhibition and deployed anti-Western discourse in as a way to serve as justification for their reasons for removing and censoring certain artwork in the exhibition. But however, amongst all of that chaos that happened surrounding the exhibition, I found that it was truly an intersectional praxis in itself. There was one piece in particular called 17 by Janar Taratova and Aida Musomokova, which was both a visual and sonic experience that forced me to engage with the complexities of everyday life in Central Asia as a Central Asian migrant in Moscow, where class, race, ethnicity, nationality, and the afterlife of colonialism collided. This piece was the center of the exhibition and was dedicated to the 17 Central Asian women who were killed in a textile factory fire in Moscow in 2016. The feature, it also featured kind of mixed voices. So some of the voices were performed, but some of the voices were also real. I stood in the art installation, or as I stood in the art installation, I went through the ordinary day with the youngest victim of this textile fire, following her voice, hearing her footsteps, listening to her phone calls back home, listening to her conversations with coworkers, and eventually hearing her screams. I felt the connections and links with what seemed to be irreconcilable subjectivities and experiences, and post-colonial conditions that on the surface seem to be the opposite. So with all that said, in conclusion, these experiences led me to think about how concepts and praxis travel and then are re-articulated in particular contexts and at particular moments. And in that moment, standing in the art installation, theorization was at work in a very different form. And I became open to it and what it could teach me. So for instance, I thought of many questions. For instance, how do I account for people who are not of the Black diaspora traditionally speaking, but are Blackened? How does Central Asia aid in further expand conceptualizations and notions of race? And what does it mean to engage with Central Asia from this perspective? I found and continue to find that in order to participate in research about Central Asia, there must be a dialogue between post-colonial and post-socialist studies. And by this, I mean a two-way street. In post-socialist studies, like how can post-socialist studies help inform post-colonial contexts and vice versa? I also find that I'm embracing this wayward path by incorporating Black feminist literature and tradition to think alongside and about feminisms in Central Asia. And in this case, for me, I'm thinking of the notion of waywardness in the same way, or following Saida Hartman and how she offers us to think about it. And as waywardness is not something that is negative, but seeks to challenge the status quo and to create its own path. I believe that Black feminist tradition has a transnational perspective that refuses individualism and compartmentalization. I can't say that word. Which are both tools and logics of white supremacy. And I think that Black feminism, by way, also pushes towards, by refusing these things, pushes towards collectiveness, right? So in conclusion, I would like to take this moment, and it may be cheesy, but I would like to call for a return to collective and collaborative practice and an embracement of methodologies that are syncretic. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alexa. I now want to pass it to our next speaker today. Professor Liz Porter is assistant professor at Texas State University, where he teaches courses on the history of Russia and Eurasia. So Liz, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amaryllis, and to the Kennan Institute for inviting me to give remarks today. I really appreciate this opportunity to kind of talk about my experiences in the context of sort of Black History Month and my career studying Russia and Eurasia in the broader region. So thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk not so much about my research, but more about some of my personal hardships that I've had as a person of color in the field. I have reservations about doing this. I don't particularly like to talk about my experiences that much, especially in these kind of public formats. And I think the profession has actually been quite good to me. I've been incredibly lucky and privileged to make it where I am. I'm in a tenure track job. I have job security. I have health insurance, right? So my discussion of personal hardship today is not sort of necessarily to critique my experience and how people have treated me. But now I mentor students and I mentor students of color who are kind of up and coming and have not attained that success, have not had that privilege, and have not had that luck. So I want to talk about my personal hardships to kind of highlight some of the things that students of color might face who haven't kind of reached the promised land of the tenure track, if you will. So that's kind of how I'm thinking of situating this, is my sort of personal experiences, but I'm hoping that if anybody can identify with them kind of up and coming, that they'll be helpful to kind of raise the discussion and kind of stoke discussion. So I'm going to really actually just sort of raise 3 questions or issues based on my personal experience. I have some answers and thoughts on how to address these questions or issues, but I want to raise kind of discussion. So hopefully during the Q&A, we can kind of address some of these questions or issues that I have. So the first issue is kind of specific to, I think, people of color and Black people who study Russia in particular, and perhaps the broader kind of Eurasian region. The second issue is something that I think is not always connected to issues of diversity and inclusion, but is directly related to it and fundamental to it. So the second issue, which I'll highlight in a moment, is I think something that's a universal, but will affect people of color in the field specifically. The third and last issue that I'm going to talk about, I don't hear talked about much, particularly in our field, but kind of generally. And it's a far more kind of personal issue to me. The other 2 are too, but the third one particularly is very, very sort of personal and close to home with me, and I'm hoping to kind of raise it, to kind of introduce it, because I think it'll appeal to others too, if I sort of talk about it. So back to the first issue that I think is more specific to people of color and Black people in the field. The first issue has to do with our profession as researchers. And the question I want to raise is, how do we make our profession inclusive when much of the region we study does not necessarily share our notion of inclusiveness and diversity? I want to tell a little bit of an anecdote from my own experiences to kind of highlight this. When I first went to study abroad in Russia, way back in 2008 as a sophomore in college, I went to the study abroad program I was attending, orientation, in a hotel in St. Petersburg. The leader of the orientation, a white American, was going over the basic safety and security issues of living in the country. I was caught totally off guard when the leader of the orientation singled me out in front of everyone as someone who should not do certain things or go certain places in Russia because of my skin color. The orientation leader brought me up repeatedly as an example to the 20 or so other white students of someone who is at risk of being chased by skinheads, stopped by police, and generally being treated like a second-class citizen. My fellow students, clearly uncomfortable with the orientation leader's references to me personally, proceeded to laugh at the idea of my danger. And so I became kind of the running joke of the orientation. I soon learned that many of these warnings were valid, right? Particularly in 2008, but from what I've heard, it hasn't changed too much over the years. And I know that many of my colleagues who are not white have experienced similar situations and even worse. So my question is, how do we improve the experiences of students visiting Russia for language study or research who are not white? Can we do anything at all? Is our profession just more risky for people not perceived as white? One of the reasons I ask this now is that looking back, part of me in my 20s was foolish and wanted to go to Russia because of the danger. But now that I mentor students, I'm far more wary of this aspect, right? I'm far more wary of encouraging my Black undergraduates, my undergraduates of color, of going to study language in Russia or doing research in Russia as graduate students. I have students who come to me, saying I want to do a PhD in Russian history, And I have to tell them, you know, you have to go do archival research in the country, and this might be a danger for you, right? So I want to kind of raise that issue to hear my colleagues' sort of personal experiences with that and any possible ways of kind of negotiating that. And I know Amaryllis in particular has dealt with this at Howard University. So that's the first kind of issue. The second question I want to raise is, how can we build an inclusive environment for the new up and coming scholars of color who are in our field if there are really no career prospects for them? This also comes from my personal experience. I was in 2018 when I defended my dissertation to the beginning of 2020, both underemployed and then unemployed for a period of time. And I had a son, my son was born at the time. So this was a real sort of crisis for me. And I felt like I was falling through the cracks then, even though now I've sort of luckily made it into a job. So the job market is completely imploded. I don't think that's any secret to anybody. A quarter of PhDs end up not in tenure track positions. And so while this issue is not often discussed as a Black issue, it absolutely is. Because our profession is diversifying, I think, and I hope, just as jobs with basic benefits are disappearing. So I think that this is a racial justice issue. It's an intersectional issue, right? It's something that is incredibly important. And there's a working group for solidarity in Russian studies that is addressing a lot of this as we speak. So I encourage everyone out there to take part in adjunctification and precarity issues as a racial justice issue, right? Not as just something that is not. It is part of Black social justice, right? Economic issues are part of that. My question is then, given that all jobs, a quarter of jobs are on the tenure track, how does inclusion and diversity in our field empower Black people if, for every Black person who obtains an assistant professorship like me, 3 find themselves faced with the choice of either leaving the profession or remaining adjunct faculty, most of whom make substantially less money than the median starting salary of a recent Black college graduate, and a quarter of whom rely on some type of public assistance. How do we prevent academia, including our field, from reproducing the class inequalities Black people face across the economy? Can we really call having a few successful model minorities like myself some kind of social justice? This brings me to my last question, which is something very kind of close to home with me personally that I'd like to raise. And I think it is important because this is a Black History Month. So this question is, what does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be Black in the American context, in the Russian context, and sort of general? I think everybody has a notion of this, right? But I think that it's a lot more fluid than people think, right? And I just really want to kind of get this home as my final point. And I'll use myself as an example. So genetically, I am half Black, right? I am mixed. I'm as Black as Barack Obama, right? In terms of sort of my genetics and that kind of notion of race, no matter how problematic that is. My heritage is also something that has been incredibly impacted by the history of racism in this country, right? My family, you know, I'm a descendant of slaves, experienced Jim Crow in the South, experienced Northern racism in Northern cities, which is, you know, a whole different kind of breed that is not talked about enough. I always get this sort of, oh, you're in the South, that must be terrible line from people. And the North is not great either. So, you know, this legacy of racism is there for me. And yet to look at me, you wouldn't know that, right? To look at me, I do not present as Black. Some people would say I pass, but I think it's a little more complicated than that, and I'll get to that right now. So I want to refer, and I'm almost done here, back to my experiences at the study abroad orientation mentioned at the beginning of this talk. I remember feeling deeply embarrassed and alarmed after the orientation leader had singled me out. I had wanted to visit Russia because I liked reading Tolstoy. But by the end of the orientation, I was afraid to leave the hotel. It took me years to get over these anxieties. But what also bothered me was the fact that the whole premise of these warnings was that I would be mistaken for something that I was not. I would not be attacked because I looked Black in the American sense, the orientation leader warned, but because I looked like I was from Chechnya. In other words, I was not a person with a particular racial heritage, whether Black, white, or brown, but some kind of empty canvas onto which people projected their racial assumptions. This is what scholars of race call monoracism, or the refusal to accept multiraciality and the constant need to shoehorn people into certain pure ethnic or racial groups. This feeling of constantly being mistaken, constantly being denied my heritage based on appearance, followed me into graduate school and fed my imposter syndrome. I was asked more than once if I had put my Black heritage onto my application for graduate school. The implication being that I was an otherwise not Black person cynically using my race to get ahead. Conversely, if I did not raise my Black heritage, I was accused of passing. I was damned if I expressed pride in my Black heritage because I wasn't Black enough, and damned if I laid claim to it with too much stridency. I refer to these personal experiences to make a point. With the well-documented increase in so-called mixed people in the US, I think it's important for our field to broaden our understanding of race and Blackness. Up-and-coming scholars will not necessarily fit into the monoracial categories people are comfortable with. And I think there has been no real attempt to reckon with this fact other than to assign them to either Black or white, depending on the circumstances. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Louis. And we'll be coming back to some of these comments during Q&A. And finally, I want to introduce Kimberly St. Julian-Varnon. She is a doctoral student in history at the University of Pennsylvania. And the floor is yours, Kimberly.
Thank you, and thank Howard for having me again, and the Kennan Institute for hosting this amazing panel. So I am going to talk a little bit about my experiences as a Black woman from the South, from a rural Texas town in this field, but also about my research and kind of what it means to study Black women as a Black woman in doing Russian and Soviet history. So I come from, a very small rural town in Texas. My parents went to segregated schools. And so I'm a first generation college student. I'm a first generation graduate student. And for some reason in college, I decided I didn't want to go to law school. I wanted to be a Russian and Soviet historian. And I started taking Russian my junior year of college, which advice to everyone, don't wait until your junior year to start Russian. It gets harder as you get older. And I pursued my master's degree at Harvard, and my first experience in the post-Soviet space was in Ukraine. I was in Odessa and Kiev a few months before the Euromaidan protests, and that was a transformative experience for me because, much like Louis, I was terrified. I had Googled racism in Ukraine, and what I got back was absolutely horrifying. So much so that my mom and dad begged me not to go. They said, "Why are you doing this? Why, can't you do research on something else? Why can't you just do American history? Why do you have to put yourself in this position?" And I actually canceled my flight. And it took a lot of talking with my advisor from Swarthmore, Robert Weinberg, my amazing mentor at Harvard, Sergei Plokhy, to get me on that plane. And I talked to them almost every day when I was in Ukraine. And I had some hair-raising experiences. I didn't go out at night unless I was surrounded by people. I was constantly watching my back. When I was on the subway, I made sure I was near an exit in case skinheads got on. I ran into a group of skinheads. So it's very harrowing to be a person of color in this field. And I love Louis's question about, we have to think about ethically when we're bringing students in, what are we bringing them in for? How do we prepare them? But not just preparing them, but preparing their families. I have a husband now, I'm doing a PhD. And so I have to, my dissertation will bring me to Russia and Ukraine, among other places. And so preparing my husband for what could happen to me, and re-preparing my family. So these are conversations that we have to have and think about not only our students, but their families. These are not, individuals isolated from other people. There are many people who care about them who will be concerned and ask them the same questions my parents asked me when I went to Ukraine. And really, I left the field for 6 years. I needed to process the trauma of constantly being hyper aware of where you are, of being afraid of every noise, of just not being able to have some of those experiences that your cohort mates have when you all come back and share your stories, about the field. I didn't get to share a lot of good stories because I didn't have as many as they did. And so I came back though, because I love what I do. I am a Russian, Eastern European, Soviet historian. I love working on it. American history just doesn't get me like Soviet and Central Asian, Eastern European history do. And so my work now is on the constructions and understandings of race in the Soviet Union and East Germany. And what I want to talk about today is about Black women, African-American women within Soviet and Russian history, because admittedly, we don't have a lot of information about the number of African-Americans who went to the Soviet Union. We don't have a lot of clear information on that. And so this kind of brings me to this conversation about overlooked stories, but also stories that have been erased, stories that have not been written down. Especially for Black women. Black women are incredibly underrepresented in our understandings and narratives of the Black American experience in the Soviet Union. And so 3 of these women, Emma Harris, Louise Thompson Patterson, and Margaret Glasgow, are very important to our understanding of race, but also gender and the intersections of those in Soviet and Russian history. Emma Harris was a Black woman from the South, and she joined a singing group and she toured all around Europe, including Russia. And she found herself in pre-revolutionary Russia. She allegedly was the mistress of a duke and had 6 servants. And then 1917 happened. And so then she suddenly became part of the proletariat. She had to learn how to work in a factory. And they called her the Mammy of Moscow because she kind of became the substitute mother figure for all the African Americans who ended up in Moscow following the Russian Revolution. They would meet her. She was fluent in Russian, and she would kind of introduce them to what they were getting into in the Soviet Union. She kind of became notorious around the Soviet Union. I would say notorious, but she became famous because she would give these brilliant speeches about the Scottsboro Boys. So for so many people in the Soviet Union to see a Black woman speaking fluent Russian and talking about issues of race in the Soviet Union from a first person's point of view was rare. And unfortunately, we only really see Emma Harris when she's talked about by male African-American travelers who are writing about their experiences. Langston Hughes, the journalist Homer Smith, they mention her and they kind of talk about her. And that's really the only time we get to see Emma Harris as a figure in this history. The next is Louise Thompson Patterson. And she's mentally close to me right now because I've been using a lot of her archival materials. She was an early member of the Communist Party of the United States. She, set up the Friends of the Soviet Union group in Harlem. She had wide-ranging connections across the United States with the early Communist Party. She was an educator. She was a civil rights leader. And a lot of her political views stems from being a Black woman, who used to teach in the South, who was educated, one of the very early women to graduate from college. And she's actually the organizer of the famous Black and White film group that was supposed to go to the Soviet Union. She organized it. She hunted down the money to fund the trip. And you can see across her notes and her correspondence, that trip would not have happened without her. And she went on the trip and she wrote diligent notes. She wanted to come back to the United States and give lectures about her experiences in the Soviet Union and what she experienced in the Soviet Union as a Black woman. For her to see and talk to Uzbek women in particular, to talk about the rapid social changes that they experienced, from being able to get divorced, to pursue education, to becoming leaders in community groups. These are new things that Louise Thompson Patterson saw and knew were possible in the United States for African American women. So her contact and experience with Central Asian women radicalized her to push further for more radical feminist politics in the 30s in the United States. And finally, Margaret Glasgow, who I found in a random book in the basement of the Harvard Widener Library one day. She wrote a letter. It was published in like this Foreign Workers to the Soviet Union collection. It's a page and a half long. But in this letter, she talks about how she was a hairdresser in New York and she couldn't get work. White clients didn't want her. And her son writes to her from Moscow and says, "Mom, come to Moscow. There's so much work. They can't find enough Soviet people to do it." And she goes, she makes this, months-long trip on a whim, hoping there'd be something better. And there was. She becomes a shock worker. She's one of the best workers in the Stalingrad auto plant. She gets the best meals. She gets all these privileges because she's a really good worker. And I found a clip from her. She came back to the United States to visit and they asked her, are you going to stay in the United States? Do you miss home? She said, "No, I'm just here to meet my family. My real home is the Soviet Union." And for this woman, this Black woman to say this, in 1935, to have the gumption to say that. But more importantly, for Soviet history and how she could be remembered, very few people know about Margaret Glasgow. They do know about her son, Lloyd Patterson, and her grandson, James Lloydovich Patterson. If you've ever seen the 1936 movie, The Circus, there is a mixed race child. That baby is James Lloydovich Patterson, her grandson. And so she has this amazing connection to Soviet culture and Soviet history, but very few people know about her. Very few people, in Soviet history know about Louise Thompson Patterson. We know about Langston Hughes and Homer Smith going to the Soviet Union, but she was the reason they were able to go. And so just kind of highlighting these stories and talking about the issues that we face when we have to use very close readings and read against the grain and find the spots where African-American women are talked about and bring out their stories in our investigation of race in the Soviet Union, but also gender in the Soviet Union, because these are intimately connected. And we can't flatten the experiences of African-American men and African-American women because they are fundamentally different in how they saw the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union and its citizens interacted with them. And so as I close, I think that something key for me to discuss is one of the issues I found with being a Black woman in this field is the fear. I put off this project for a long time. I didn't want to be the Black person who wrote about Black people in the Soviet Union. And it took a long time for me to say, okay, but this is the work I want to do. And I end by saying, no matter what my work may look like, because I've always told my dissertation advisor, one day I'm just going to quit and become a medieval Russian historian. That's going to be it. But I am a Soviet, Russian, Eastern European, and Central Asian historian. That's how I have been trained, and that's what I've dedicated my life to, and that's what I do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. I'm going to take a second and give the shout out after Kimberly's small presentation to the archivists that make this possible. Archivists at Moreland Spring Arm Research Center at Howard University, at the libraries in Atlanta, the consortium that includes Emory University, where Mary Louise Patterson's papers are housed. I jokingly call this to my students as the Great Swiss Cheese Project, because you find these names and you find these files and they are so evocative, and you have to sort of figure out what to do with what's basically this piece of historical Swiss cheese. So thank you so much for bringing this up, Kimberly. And I want to now move to question and answers. So I want to remind the audience that if you have a question for our speakers, you can submit them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org. Or you can just go ahead to Twitter @Kennan Institute and put the question in the little question box there, or on the Facebook page for the Kennan Institute. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. And as the moderator, I do get the privilege of the first two questions. And I want to thank the Kennan, and hopefully you all realize that the questions I'm going to ask, we could have full conferences on the questions I'm about to ask. So here we go. So the first question, right, I think about a lot as an instructor at Historically Black University, and it's this challenge of the decoupling of area studies from ethnicity, right? And we find actually a lot of us through social media these days, particularly Kimberly. If you follow her on Twitter, you see lots of very intelligent comments, including the one that she posted yesterday, which is, I'm often treated only as a scholar of race or African-American history. These are interesting characterizations of my work because I have trained as a historian of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. My master's thesis was on Ukraine. Speaking on Ukraine is returning to my intellectual home. As a Puerto Rican, I know that my mother still shakes her head that I would choose in January to go do research in St. Petersburg instead of having chosen Puerto Rican studies and going to San Juan, where she and her sisters could provide Tiotia daycare to my children. So to my speakers, right, the question is, how do you see this perspective of scholars of color contributing to new methods of research within the greater field? So if y'all want to go ahead and take turns. Gone ahead.
I could tackle this one first, because I've been thinking about it a lot. I think that the questions I ask as a historian are definitely, they come from the position in which I occupy and this body I occupy in the country that I live in, right? But also because like my master's thesis was on the famine in Ukraine because I grew up on a farm. So I'm fascinated by peasants. And like so the questions I asked about that were because I was seeing how the historiography treated peasants. And I said, you don't know farmers. Like, this isn't how farmers think, right? And so I think that our experiences help us ask questions that people just haven't thought of. Like my current research is because I saw an Afro-Ukrainian woman and we both just looked at each other in Kiev and we're like, what are you doing here? And that's literally where my research comes from. Like I wanted to know where do Afro-Ukrainians come from? Where do Afro-Russians come from? Do they think of themselves as Black? Are they thought of as Black? Like these are all questions that come from this experience. And so I think that a lot of what we do definitely comes from our positionality, but it's also the cool thing about being a newer scholar is we can access all the scholarship that's out now, but also we are a different generation. The way we frame questions, the way we think about conflict is different. And so we can bring that into our work. So I wouldn't necessarily say like my race automatically means the way I look at the world in the Soviet world, especially, is fundamentally different. But my experiences occupying this world definitely make my views on the Soviet Union and Russian and East European history a little bit different, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And just to kind of add to that, the notion of which Americans are kind of allowed to sort of gaze at Russia, right, is there's a kind of invisible notion and assumption that it's white people, right? And even when I was in Russia, I don't know if others experienced this, there's a notion, you know, even among many Russians that I met, that white people are the normative of America. That's what white people, you know, that there isn't, that is what, you know, Americans are, or the white people. And so I think, you know, the different perspective, but also I think kind of undermining that notion of who gets to kind of study other areas is really important, right? Because I think it is always implicit that we'll have some sort of unique notion or positionality, right? And that others don't, right? But other people have positionality too, they just don't have to talk about it. You know, so I think that that's another kind of thread to that.
And just also kind of bouncing off what Kimberly mentioned, and about having also like the space to bring these experiences in. Just, you know, I think back to like, okay, what if this was, you know, back in 20 years ago when Sherard Chari and Catherine Verdi were writing about the dialogue between post-socialist studies and post-colonial studies, you know, that type of thing, or that literature enables me to actually feel comfortable and, you know, to talk about things such as race in the space of Eurasia. And it's not also necessarily that like race is the thing that determines that, like for me, but is like my experience in Brighton Beach talking to grandmas, like literally all day. Like, like in 2007, like I found myself in Brighton Beach on like this domestic missionary trip, because at that time I was a Jehovah's Witness, but I'm not now, you know, and that was a very like random formative experience that led me to doing the research now that I'm doing now and thinking about the Soviet Union, because before that I had no idea about, like, I also just perceived like Russia or the Soviet Union as white, right? So being in Brighton Beach actually like really like debunked a lot of that for me. And I think sometimes that people assume just because someone is African-American or Black, right, and they're doing this research that they are, I don't know, at least I've gotten pushback, and it seems like they are racializing me as angry and wanting to kind of like take what I'm, you know, race and put it onto this particular context. But it's like, no, I actually am coming from a very formative experience that was happening right here in the US in a Russian community. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. The second question, Kimberly started and Liz started talking about that, which is, so I teach at the only historically Black university. So I'm training students to go study abroad. So the question is about field research. So unlike other scholars, really, we can't do sort of the plateau around the head and go and hide, right? We just stand out. How do you think the field is adapting to the specific challenges that scholars of color face when conducting research abroad? And I'm particularly thinking because there are departments where it's primarily white faculty advising students of color how to go conduct field research.
I guess I can start maybe because I did my dissertation research now like 7 years ago, so it's been quite a while. So maybe like I can talk more about how it's been back then. No one talked about race when I was coming through. It was just sort of, I think it was kind of the color blindness, right? Like we're not seeing you as racist, therefore you don't experience race, except for that study abroad program where I got called out, right? And I think people don't know how to kind of navigate. One, you either make the person feel like you're in danger, or just don't mention it at all, right? And so for the study abroad, I got a lot of warnings, and then in graduate school, I got you're invisible, basically. We don't see your race, and so there was practically nothing sort of done to address it. So just to sort of kind of contribute to sort of start off, that's kind of my experience.
I think, yeah, I totally agree with Lewis. I think a lot of programs aren't comfortable with it, and because a lot of them don't know how to deal with it. And so it is the race neutrality, race blindness, or race blindness harms students of color. And for many programs, this may be the first time a student of color has been with them and had to go abroad, so they don't know what's going on, and the student doesn't know, and the program doesn't know. And so in that situation, thank goodness we have this little whisper network, we call it now, where we, help each other out and talk to students of color who are going to the region. But I didn't have that. And, I went to Ukraine, and I'd still say, like Sergei Pohi, he told me, he said, I don't know what you're going to go through, but I'll be there and support you in any way I can. And just knowing that is one of the reasons why I got on the plane, because I'm like, okay, someone cares, someone will be there for me. And I think programs have definitely gotten a lot better since I was an undergrad in 2008 to understand like we have these problems. But a key issue I think all programs have to understand, it is important you support your students before they go, while they're there, but you have to take care of them when they get back. These students will be processing experiences they probably never thought they would have, and you have to help them through that. And it will be uncomfortable, but I'd rather be uncomfortable than like not be alive. And you really have to consider that when you're dealing with undergraduates, and especially with the graduate students, because we're even more isolated in the archives. Like we don't necessarily have that built-in network. So those are key issues I think the field still has to grapple with, in particular, is dealing with graduate student research and that isolation part.
Well, I feel like it's, I guess, getting a little better now, but I've definitely been on programs that I had issues with. It wasn't just like the pre-departure meeting, but it was actually the on-site meeting. And there seemed to be a disconnect between talking to faculty that were actually in country. Because then there was kind of the pre-departure meeting, which they either, like you're saying, deal with race or they just don't. And then there was another on-site meeting, which was the same iteration of that, but it was just like, okay, race is nothing here. So then we didn't talk about it, and being jet lagged and tired and doing this on-site meeting and listening to that is just, again, it was just, I was already traumatized before I left and then re-traumatized when I got there. And I will say this though, that I feel like, at least in my experience, before I have left to places, I did do my own like research. Although it is hard to find, like, you can't just go on YouTube and be like, okay, I'm just gonna do like, look up a travel blog or a vlog on Kyrgyzstan, and you know, who comes up is like this like white cis het man with his like backpack, and it's like, no, this is not the same experience that I'm gonna have, you know, being on a bus or marshrutka from Tashkent to Bishkek. So like, I found myself having to, you know, kind of take those experiences and be like, okay, I know this isn't gonna actually be the way that it's presented here, and trying to find elaborate ways of, you know, navigating those spaces and navigating them or mapping them out even before I get there. So, but I think that maybe we are headed in the right direction at this point, and I hope that it will be much better for students who are going abroad in the future.
Wonderful, thank you. So I am going now to move to questions from the audience. The first question we have is from Susan Summers Esquire, who's a domestic violence consultant. It looks like it's mostly addressed to Alexa, which is, have you had interactions with women in the Central Asian diaspora communities, principally in New York City, such as Southern Brooklyn, Rego Park, or Forest Hill, Queens, about domestic violence, domestic abuse in their communities? Have you found that norms that may be tolerated or accepted in Central Asia have influenced how they engage with their immigrant life? And would you care to share any insights that you might have?
That's a good question. And I actually have not been in contact with those communities in New York City, so I can't really speak to that particularly, and I don't feel comfortable doing so since I haven't.
So I want to remind the audience, Alexa currently is at University of California, Berkeley. So yeah, go ahead, yeah.
So yeah, I to that question about domestic violence, I don't know that I can actually answer that question.
Great. So question number 2. And this is something that we think about, particularly as Puerto Rican. I'm still sort of waiting for the next Puerto Rican who's going to have the PhD in Slavic languages and literatures. So the question is the lack of representation in Russian or Eurasian studies a result of lack of recruitment, retainment, something else? So opening the floor.
I would like to go first on this, actually. I think that it's a combination of those things. I mean, it can also be recruitment, right? But I think that also it's about accessibility as well, and that like, and I'm even coming from thinking from my own discipline of anthropology. Like, there aren't a lot of Black students doing anthropology. Like, I was the only, maybe there was like 2 of us, maybe in a class, introductory class of like 300 students, right? And because their idea of anthropology is mostly associated with, this is also cheesy, but Indiana Jones, because people think that anthropology is only archaeology, right? And only white people do that. So, which is not true at all. There are Black archaeologists and they're completely brilliant, right? So I think it's also about like what, in this context, mostly I think that we also associate with being something, you know, something reserved for whiteness and a space reserved for whiteness as well, but also combined with, you know, recruitment. And also, again, going back to the conversation of like, once someone is recruited, how are we going to take care of them and how will they flourish in that space?
So I think it's definitely all of the above. I think it's a combination of many, many things. The one thing I want to spotlight, just sort of from my own family's experience and my experience, is a broader problem in the humanities, which is the lack of stable employment, health insurance. I'm from a middle class family. My dad was first gen. He grew up in poverty. He went to Howard. My grandparents didn't graduate from high school. So while I'm sort of economically privileged as a second generation student, the vast majority of my family either never went to college or went to college to get out of poverty. There's also a question of what is going to get you a job, and I think that this also reverberates beyond the Black community too. I wrote about this in Slavic Review a while back. It's this idea of well, what are you going to do with that, right? And I hate to bring that up again, but the people in my family who have gone to college, they went for things that are going to get them jobs because education is seen as a way out of poverty, and it is not sort of education for its own sake, right? And I know that that's like that kind of brings down what we're doing, but it's important. It's the reason we all work, right? We all work to make a living and to have stable lives, right? We're not there for our jobs. Our jobs are supposed to be there for us, at least hypothetically.
I'd have to agree. I think this is a good question. And I think so often it's framed as, oh, Black students aren't interested in Russia and, the region. I've been obsessed with the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union since I was in 5th grade. And I watched this 8-hour miniseries on the History Channel, one day. So I think it's not a question of Black students and students of color just aren't interested. A lot of them have never been exposed to the region or the country. If I hadn't watched that, that documentary, if I didn't have access to National Geographic, I wouldn't have known about Russia or Ukraine or Central Asia. I wouldn't have known about any of these places until I took world geography as a high schooler. And by high school, especially your junior, senior year, you're thinking about your major. And I'm first gen, and I paid for college on my own. I could not lollygag. I had to think about how can I support myself because I can't just move back home with my parents, And so I think that a key issue is socioeconomically thinking about how can you secure a job. And I think we're seeing this crisis across academia with PhD enrollments are high and there are no jobs, right? And people are going into doctoral programs thinking there's a job at the end, and there's not for the overwhelming majority of us. Another issue is when you recruit students of color, you don't just have to say, I kind of don't like how an approach now is like, oh, here's some Black people who went to Russia. So you're Black and you should study Russia too. That what drew me to Russia was Rasputin and Peter the Great. I did not know about African Americans and Black people in Russia until I was a first-year master's student at Harvard, right? I think what is the history of the region itself, the culture of the region, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, these are the things that are universal that apply to Black students and Latino students just as much as they do to white students, right? So you just have to be good at teaching and actually reach out to students and they will come. Now, if they stay, that's up to you and mentoring and doing what you have to do to keep the students there. But we're definitely here and we're definitely interested.
Sort of to add my 2 cents worth, there's also, I think, the question of where can you get the tools for the field? The Modern Language Association released a report that showed that between 2013 and 2016, over 300 language programs were closed across the United States, the disproportionate amount in less commonly taught languages. If you combine that with the socioeconomic condition of students of color and where they go to school, and you map that on the programs that historically teach Russian, the fact that Howard University has taught Russian for 60 years weighs heavily on my mind. The fact that it's the only HBCU with a Russian program, it gains even more of a great responsibility. So that's definitely another thing to think about. Where can these students go to get these tools, right? But the next question we have is, Has studying Russia and the region changed how the scholars perceive or identify themselves? So
I think it depends, right? Like I grew up in the South, so my race has never been a question. Like I have always been Black and I've always been a Black woman. I have darker skin. So what was interesting to me, like I've been to Serbia, I've been to Bulgaria, Ukraine, was how people thought where I could be from. Like that what was interesting to me is that people perceive me as something like not African American. Some people thought I was from South Africa. Some people, they heard my accent and say, "Are you from Boston?" I'm like, "Can you not hear Southeast Texas?" So I think if anything, it hasn't made me question my identity. It's made me, and this is my dissertation topic, it makes me wonder how the discourses of race are different and how context is so important to that. So my experiences with being asked, "Where are you from? You know, why does your hair look like that?" These questions have kind of informed my understanding that race is very fluid and the American idea of race is only one of many. And we have to, really understand that and question that more often.
I think that's kind of a hard question, right? Because I have no idea who I would be if I wasn't a Russian historian. I'm now the Russian historian who is me, right? Like, I don't know. But yeah, like just being someone who society calls mixed race, I've always considered myself like, and I know this sounds colorblind and weird, me, right? Like I'm me, right? Like and I've been identified by society as mixed, as passing. I've also been identified, depending on where I am, as different races. I grew up in Philadelphia that has a strong Dominican and Puerto Rican community. So I was almost always confused to be either Dominican or Puerto Rican, right? Like people would come up in the street and start speaking Spanish to me, and I never took Spanish. So I guess it added a layer of like kind of that racial experience, in that it never occurred to me when I was 20 years old in 2008 that I looked Chechen. Like I didn't know that, and who knows if that's not even a universal thing, right? So like the way that people present, at least the way mixed people present, is so situational. It just sort of added more confusion. So that's my really inadequate answer to that.
Yeah, that is a very difficult question. But I think again, I think I'm just mostly like, I had a very narrow view of what race was prior to becoming engaged with studies of the Soviet Union and or going abroad to Central Asia and Russia. And I think again, what Kimberly was saying earlier about like how people perceive you in a space. I just never thought that, oh yeah, someone would refer to me as mulatto. Like I just, yeah, exactly. I see Kimberly's face, but yeah, just something like that, and kind of guessing, and the idea that I think what actually also like this also kind of provoked more questions for me as well in my research, because they always assumed that I was either like, they thought maybe I was from Cuba, they thought maybe I was African, but they never said, oh, you might be African American. And so that was something that was really striking to me. And then when I would say, hey, yeah, I'm from Chicago, like, yeah. And they're just like, wow, what? Like, so just those types of interactions were more intriguing to me than, anything else, I think.
So we have two questions that I'm going to sort of combine, and they stem from Alexa's statements, which is Alexa rightly emphasized the active nature of forgetting versus more passive erasure. So how do you think a field centered on forgetting would look, particularly when, some conjecture the dominance of Cold War era anti-communist sentiment has facilitated the forgetting of the African American Soviet nexus. I know that this is something I deal with a lot with my students, particularly that collection of letters by Mary Louise Patterson, where she talks about organizing the trip. I'm actually working with that with my students now. And it's just really interesting because I'm like, look at this. She was full-blown communist, and don't forget, 20 years down the road, the McCarthy era would come, right? And sort of that complicated relationship the Black community has had with communism. So there you go. Whoever wants to take that first.
I mean, I would say publishing the great research that Kimberly just mentioned, right? Filling those blank spots in the research is a great sort of first step, right? So that's what I mean. I was just fascinated with the research that was mentioned during this talk, and I think that that's a great kind of step to not forgetting and remembering and not erasing.
I think a key part here, Joy Gleason Carroll mentions this in her book, is also kind of understanding why you can't solely depend on the archive, especially when you're dealing with Soviet history, this heavy reliance on government documents, as if the archive in itself is not a construction. But thinking about also, and Maxim Matusevich has also written about this, how many African Americans coming back from the Soviet Union changed their testimony to diplomatic officials and embassy officials because they were afraid. This is also 1925, 1930s. This is also the Red Scare. They did not want any positive word for the Soviet Union or contacts with the Soviet Union to be used against them later on in the United States. And I mean, we see this with Paul Robeson, we see this with Langston Hughes, Louise Thompson Patterson held fast, but she was also, a target of McCarthy. So remembering, you have to constantly remind yourself of the historical context in which these documents are produced or in which documents are not produced and stories are not told. And it's just difficult. And this isn't just particular to Soviet history. Throughout historical studies, African-American and Black women are underrepresented. So I think this is something like the entire field of history is grappling with right now.
I think I have a very short answer to this, but like I said, unforgetting and forgetting, those are both actions. So I would say there just needs to be some action towards like this kind of like what Louis was saying earlier, also like, this research coming out, there's research coming out, there's action being made, right? And I think that also bouncing off of my partner who is sending me WhatsApp messages right now and listening to this, saying that systematic change is really important. And I completely agree with him on that. So I think that will be a big part of the unforgetting as well.
Great. So, sorry. Here we go. Another question from the audience. Experience in our region has become in many places a key feature of hiring criteria, the field research component. What are your thoughts on this trend and how it contributes to the marginalization of scholars of color?
I don't think it's a recent trend. I think it's kind of been part and parcel of working on the region for decades, right? So before the Cold War, at least when I was an undergrad and going to grad school, a lot of the older guard just had these stories of, tropping around Moscow or St. Petersburg, and everyone has like their going to Moscow and getting arrested and it's really funny story, or, bribing police story. And like, that is not something I ever want to experience, and just, or if you want the best experience, just pick up and move to the region. Just go live in Moscow for 2 years, and you'll get expertise. And I'm not being facetious. I think that's great for a lot of people, but I just do not have the emotional bandwidth to have to live in Moscow continuously for 2 years, right? Like, it's hard. And I think many students of color come into this field, like we will go abroad and we'll spend our time there and do what we have to do. But I think this whole idea that you can only know a region if you picked up and moved there and lived there and embedded yourself for 5 years, like I think that's harmful. And I'm speaking honestly, I mean, we've seen the effect of that on our foreign policy for the past 4 decades. So picking up and moving to a place doesn't mean you know the place, right? And so I think that we have to kind of balance that. While field expertise is important and it's a part of what we do, it isn't the core of what we do necessarily.
Yeah, it's always framed as this kind of like, like battle or like something you have to go through, right? You do the 9 months or whatever, or 18 months if you get the Fulbright haze of, and it's like, and then you really know, you've been with the natives, right, or something. And it's like, that is just such a weird kind of power dynamic in itself. This notion going there and like getting to know it, we have to also think about kind of the legacies of that kind of travel as kind of a colonizing, the Western gaze, right, going there and really getting to know, going native, right? That's kind of, we have to unpack that a little bit, I think.
Yeah, that's of course like a very anthropologist type thing of going elsewhere and kind of, this going native and having to rough it out. But and it's kind of silly because, you're assuming that you actually will find out things and that the native or that the locals there will actually let you into their community, right? And that they're not actually, there's not some type of refusal to embrace you or let you in, or let you know actually what's going on. So yeah, I think that it is a very harmful idea to have like, oh, I have to go here and really just suffer through this. It sounds like honestly, it sounds like hazing, right, to me. So yeah.
Okay, so I'm sort of being mindful that we have about 12 minutes left, and thank you to the audience. These have been very insightful questions. The next question is one that's very close to my heart and to a lot of us. I will mention that both Kimberly and Lewis have collaborated with our Ideas in Undergraduate Restudies project. So the question is, do the mentors on the panel tend to advise students towards or away from certain career paths due to concerns about socioeconomic factors such as job availability and security? And again, as a Puerto Rican and with Spanish as a first language, I think about this a lot, because I know that for the students sort of in the Spanish field, right, there's a lot more within the United States that they can apply that to. So how do we advise students towards or away from certain career paths due to concerns about socioeconomic factors such as job availability and security?
So what I often do is, because on the one hand, I used to kind of be like, I don't want to encourage people to go to get a PhD because there are no jobs, right? But I realized at one point, like 23-year-old me would not have listened to some guy in a tenure track position telling him not to do what I did, So I give them, like, I try to tell them the realities and give them alternative career ideas. But I know that if they're really passionate about it, they're going to do it. So I think it's not even like up to their personal responsibility to not take that career. I think it's up to us who are in positions of power to make this career viable. And even if that's not providing more tenure track jobs, I mean, just supporting health insurance for adjuncts or doing something to make those lives a little better, working with unionization efforts, right, across the United States, fighting for these economic rights, fighting these university administrations that are imposing austerity. It's up to us to do the right thing for them and not for them to like make the right decision. So that's kind of how I view it. And so I tell them, it's bad out there, but I don't want to totally like cramp their dreams either.
I agree. And I think it's also, you have to be careful with how you speak to students because we don't want to just recreate an academy in which only people who have means are the ones who become academics, right? So I think that's the thing. And I taught high school, for 6 years. I taught community college. So I have very much told students, and had these conversations with students. And I think you have to just be honest. Say, look, I know you love studio art, but also studio art is really hard to get into. And, they have a lot of problems with this, and this. So here's a backup plan we can work on, right? But always being honest. And like when people talk to me about going to grad school, I say, you need to be totally aware and understand and accept that at the end of this 5 to 7 year struggle, you may not have a job. You may not have financial security. And if you cannot accept that, this is not the place for you to be, right? And I think just being blunt and honest about it is really important. And then you hope that your students can make the decision for themselves. But also, just because you do one thing for 10 years doesn't mean you're going to do it the rest of your life, right? Life changes and people change, their interests change, right? So also making sure people understand that is important, I think.
Yeah, speaking from personal experience, I think when I first went to a mentor and said, hey, I want to pursue my PhD, go to graduate school. And the first thing they asked me is, are you okay with walking away from it? And I thought that was such an amazing question, because it's oh, wait, actually, I don't have to follow through with this. If it's not fitting with my life trajectory, if it's not fitting in with my mental health, if it's, affecting me in these other ways that aren't positive, then I don't have to continue doing this, right? It's not set in stone, and there's other things that I can do. But yeah, and I think out of all the people who have talked to me before I went down this path, my PhD, everyone was pretty honest and transparent about it. I don't think there was anyone who was oh, well, you'll be fine, just keep, but they were very transparent. And I honestly, I appreciate that honesty. And now when people who are coming into our anthropology program now, and when there's prospective grad students that want to talk, I say, these are the things that are happening, and I'm completely transparent with them, so that they're not walking in and just blindsided. Because, moving to a new space, being in a new program, being in a PhD program, I mean, it's a lot already. And if someone's not transparent with you about it, it could be a real culture shock, actually. And then on the other end, although I haven't made it to the other end yet, right, of graduating, but we will get there. But on the other end, that's also there's also particular steps that you need to take to get to the tenure track as well. And those things need to be transparent at the beginning, not when you're in it. So, yeah.
Great. And so one more question from the audience, and I think it'll fit just right to our allotted time, which is, do the speakers often find themselves translating for others the differences between American race categories and Russian or Soviet identifiers? And do they find receptive audiences in the United States or abroad? And I know this is an interesting concept, talking with my students, particularly when we read those travel narratives.
I mean, my latest piece of research I've done is how African Americans racialize the Uzbeks they encounter as Black, and kind of imagine them as part of this shared community, this global community of Blackness. So I think there is some translation. I mean, explaining Soviet nationalities policy and trying to help American students understand it, blows their mind. But also on the flip side, speaking to people from the region and explaining, certain differences, because you can still see the legacies of Soviet nationality policy in thinking about ethnicity and race in the region. So I think it goes both ways in terms of explaining it and translating these kind of differences.
So, I get to throw the last question, which is, of course, we've talked about the complicated nature of being a scholar of color in the field, and that there's unique challenges that we face. And I know that some of my students said they would be tuning in to listen. So, we've talked about maybe why you shouldn't, you think about it, but what do you tell students about what makes you so for lack of a better word, jazzed to be in this space right now too? Because clearly we wouldn't be here if we didn't think there was something in it for us. So what makes you still like, I am here?
I would say that, honestly, those interactions with Babushki and Brighton Beach are the thing, like, those are the things that keep me going, because, like, I don't know, it was, I was 18 in Brighton Beach, 18, 19 in Brighton Beach, away from my mom. And they were like, away from, like, my grandma had died some years earlier, and I was really close to my grandma. And I saw my grandma in some of the stories that they were telling that were similar to hers. And every time I feel like, why am I doing this? Like, why am I in this space? I remember those conversations that I had with those women, and the food we ate, the smells in those kitchens, all of that. And that's the thing that keeps me going. And that's why I'm happy to be here.
Oh yeah, quickly. I think for all the negative experience in Ukraine, I had, the people I met overall was so welcoming to me and interested in what I did and really appreciative. They're like, oh, you said Ukrainian history. Wow, why? And the same thing, I meet Russians. Like, I think that the people themselves are so good and so kind, but also, like, I freaking love what I do. I love reading about Russian peasants and like medieval history, and it's just so fascinating. And there's so much to do that's not uncovered. So I think it's a great field to be in. And like the people here, Alexa, Lewis, Amaryllis, like the culture and group I have here now is why I'm still able to do it.
Yeah, I love Russian history. I have no idea why. I tell all kinds of stories about Tolstoy, or like, but really, like, I've always been interested in like emancipation for humanity, right? And the Soviet project is that. It was the attempt to do that where class, race, all of these things that I think have been important in my background kind of intersect. And so that's why I got into it, is if you want to study issues of class, race, the Soviet project is it.
Great. So thank you so much, Alexa, Kimberly, Lewis. And thank you to those who are watching this broadcast. I hope you are as convinced as I am about, in spite of all the challenges, that there is this amazing new generation of African American and other scholars of colors emerging in our field. And it has become, in a lot of ways, a lot easier for us to meet each other, not just through professional conferences, but also through social media. So thank you for joining us today. I encourage you to visit our website if you'd like to stay up to date with upcoming events and publications, as well as our podcast, Canon X and the Russia File. You can find our latest analysis of events in Russia and the region in our Russia File and Focus Ukraine blogs, particularly these last few weeks. If you really want a good primer on what is going on between Russia and Ukraine, that is the place to go. So with that, thank you so much, Kennan Institute, for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you also to Howard University's Department of Foreign Languages and Cultures for co-sponsoring this event. And thank you, everybody, for being here. And we welcome you to our next event at the Kennan Institute. Thank you very much.